Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the GRIT seminar. The GRIT seminar was launched at the Boston College School of Social Work with its research program on children in adversity, and essentially stands for Grants and Research Initiative. And it's a monthly research group webinar designed to provide a space for investigators to receive constructive feedback and hear from other leaders in the field, such as our guest speaker today, Dean Mary McKay. And the GRIT seminar is co-sponsored by the U19 Youth Forward Project, and the PI is Teresa Betancourt. U19 Essence Hub, PIs Patel and Shidaye, and U19 Spirit Hub, PIs Patare Vijaykumar and Shields Zeman, each funded by an IMH, as well as the Boston College School of Social Work. So on to Dean Mary McKay, who's our guest speaker today. And Dean McKay joined the Brown School at Washington University in 2016. The same year I became dean here at the Boston College School of Social Work. It's my loss that I didn't get to work with Dean McKay, but it is also my gain that we get to work as collaborating deans. Thank you, Mary, for all your support you've given me and to our school here at Boston College. Dean McKay's experience really traverses multiple disciplines, including the professions of social work and public health. And she's known for considerable work with extramural funding around mental health and health prevention needs of youth and families affected by poverty. And her expertise is in child mental health services and implementation research methods, and over 20 years of experience in doing HIV prevention and care-oriented studies supported by the National Institutes of Health. She's also, part of her chops are not just about research. She has also previously served as the head of the Division of Mental Health Services Research at Mount Sinai School of Medicine. And I think these are non-trivial experiences that really shape the kind of leadership she gives both in her research, but also to the kind of collaborations she has been able to build both nationally here and in Sub-Saharan Africa. Today, she'll be speaking on collaborating with youth, families, community leaders, government officials, and policymakers to go to scale with new supports for children and their families in Sub-Saharan Africa. Welcome, Dean McKay.
Thank you. Thank you. It is actually my loss too, that we didn't get to work together at the same institution, but boy, am I happy that we're collaborating deans. And so I really appreciate that introduction. And so I am privileged to give a little bit of an overview of the work that both myself, but really my colleagues, Dr. Fred and Dr. Ozge, and so many members of our team across the continent are working on. I'm happy also to tailor this presentation to your interests. You heard me, you can see that Teresa and I know each other really well because we are also funded by the same mechanism and so get to meet and share this work. So I'm happy to answer questions and go into lots of details that most interest the people in the audience and on the electronic devices. So I am going to kind of emphasize collaboration throughout this particular talk. We are a group that are known to use community-based participatory methods, and the underlying assumption of those methods is that ultimately the programs, the services, the approaches, the policies that come out of studies like the ones that we are embarking on, they are better, they're more effective, they're more sustainable if you have really strong collaboration in the beginning. And if anybody was on the phone a few minutes early, they heard Teresa and I kind of acknowledging how really challenging it is to collaborate with our government officials and our policymakers across the continent, but also in the US. How there's a lot of methods that you could use to involve young people, families, community leaders, elected officials in your studies, but that really relationships matter a lot and persistence matters a lot. So I'll talk a little bit about that as well as we go forward. So I'm going to try to advance the slides, and then if we get one going, there we go. So just to kind of set the context, I as an investigator and our team have had long-standing relationships with different in-country U.S. African investigations. So we've, my first set of collaborations took place in the 1990s in South Africa. And currently I'm going to talk to you about work in one of our centers. We call our center Smart Africa, that is set across 4 country contexts. So Uganda, Kenya, Ghana, and South Africa. And this collaborative group of investigators, key community stakeholders, government officials, it really is all meant to improve the circumstances of young people and their families. And in particular, to really dig into children's mental health or child behavioral health and figure out in low resource contexts where there often has been substantial underinvestment in children's mental health, how you can knit together new supports that are scalable. And that's where the collaboration comes in. So in country, in Uganda, Kenya, and Ghana, we have a set of investigators and collaborators really trying to use evidence-based approaches, but to adapt them to the real world circumstances of kids in their country context, and also to make choices about those programs and services that are likely to be able to scale in contexts where there might not be the infrastructure needed to really take care of kids' mental health. So we're all about capacity building. We're all about supporting in-country investigators to really come up with new solutions. And our job, as we see it, is to bring the science to those efforts to inform kind of new kids' behavioral health supports. So these are busy centers that Teresa and I both are involved in, because there certainly is a lot of research activity. That's the box, if you look at this slide on the upper right, that in the country of Uganda, we have a scale-up study right now going on where we're testing different approaches to implementing an evidence-based child mental health intervention. When I say scale-up, sometimes these studies are really just larger than I can almost wrap my mind around, but almost 3,500 children and their families are actually being exposed, participating in an evidence-based child mental health intervention. And I'll talk to you a little bit about that scale-up research. But that's not all we're doing in the Smart Africa Center. The other piece is that we spend a lot of time capacity building and really supporting our partners in Ghana and Kenya to field their own not as big studies. They're involving 300, 400 kids and their families in a test of an evidence-based intervention to really help them get ready for scale up. We also do a lot of networking, information sharing. So just like the webinar that you're doing now, why it's not so bad for me to talk at 8 o'clock is because I'm usually 7 o'clock Central Daylight Time on the phone every morning with some of our partners in Africa. It really kind of working on sharing information, problem solving the next hurdle, all with the goal of really trying to have increased capacity to address kids' mental health needs on the continent. So I'm going to talk, this talk is kind of divided into 3 parts. So I'll talk to you a little bit about the research activities Then I'll go on to talk about what do we mean by capacity building, what are some of the kinds of investments that we're truly trying to make, and how are we influenced? Because I think what's really important is that when I think about capacity building, I think about this bi-directional influence. Certainly we are supporting our in-country investigators to do the work, but also it's shaping the work that we actually do or the teaching that we actually do. And so I'll talk about research first, and I'll talk about capacity building, and then I'll talk about our collaboration in particular with our government officials and policymakers. One of the requirements of these centers is that you maximally engage your politicians, your government officials, your policymakers in the research activities so that there really is an investment in children's mental health infrastructure building and that they have more information about evidence-based approaches to kids' mental health. So let me first spend a moment on the research. So this particular set of research activities focus on the adaptation and then testing of an evidence-based approach to kids' mental health. And in particular, we have a nationally recognized evidence-based program that we call the 4 R's and 2 S's in the US. This has been an approach that we have used and tested for more than a decade. It's an attempt to use something called a multiple family group, where multiple children and their families come together. And in the US, they come together in outpatient child mental health clinics, but they also come together in community sites, in schools, in churches. But this is an approach that you bring children and their families together to work on some of the core areas of family life that have been empirically linked to kids' conduct challenges, as well as their behavioral success. And so those of you that are raising children, or those of you that see children or families clinically, know that what happens in a family can really set the stage for whether children are successful. And if a problem emerges, families are often the first line of defense to help a child address those challenges. And there's some specific ways that families do that. And that relates to these words called the 4 R's and 2 S's. So what are the R's and the S's? They're parts of family life that help kids be behaviorally successful. So what's an example of that area? One word that begins with R, rules. The organizational structure of family really matters. And when kids are having behavioral challenges, those rules matter more because they're the safety net that keep kids reined in and not in trouble. But rules can be incredibly hard to organize in any context. And then when you add in poverty and the stresses and strains of trying to make a living or trying to eke out enough for your family to live, the organizational structure can really, kind of fray. And so multiple family groups are meant to very quickly help families put together those rules and help them to operate, so at least operate enough so that kids can be behaviorally successful. An example of an S is stress. Stress is actually one of the issues that truly undermine parents' ability to parent. And so, and some of our families in the US face enormous stresses and strains and challenges and really don't get a lot of another S support for managing those stresses and strains. Multiple family groups are meant to really help kids and families come together, work on those stressors, maximize the support in their life so that they can actually, put some additional kind of strengths in place in the family so that kids can be successful. So this protocol was put on a national registry, tested multiple times in randomized trials. So what does this have anything to do with Sub-Saharan Africa? Well, multiple family groups haven't just been used in the US. We also use them in primary prevention projects in South Africa. They were very well received. Why was that? Because it is often incredibly common for families to help each other with the challenges that they experience. And so bringing families together was, really acceptable in the US, but also really acceptable in our primary prevention, particularly around HIV in South Africa. So we knew that they held promise, but we had never used the 4Rs and 2Ss that working on kids' mental health issues in Africa. And so that's where the collaboration comes in. That to the right is the version of our Ugandan 4Rs and 2Ss that has really been kind of shaped by young people, family, community leaders, policymakers at the table, local government officials embedded in the health ministry, embedded in education, really coming together to figure out what parts of this evidence-based, manual and protocol and treatment, what parts of that really does translate to the Ugandan context, and what really does need to be adapted, because families are distinct, they have different cultural values, different worldviews, and so that intensive collaborative process took place not only in Uganda, but also in Ghana and Kenya, to really kind of take a look at the evidence-based intervention and try to figure out what parts of this really do apply and what needs to be tailored or thrown away, what new material needs to be kind of entered so that kids and families could come together in Ugandan schools, in Ugandan community centers, in Ugandan health centers to really help kids that are struggling with mental health challenges. So I mentioned research. This is the design, the experimental design that we are now fielding in Uganda and also on smaller levels in Ghana and Kenya. That schools in Uganda have been randomized to one of three conditions. Their adapted version of our multiple family group approach being delivered by trained parent peers. These are essentially parent leaders within communities and within schools. Another set of schools, we have prepared community health workers drawn from local primary clinics, primary healthcare clinics, to deliver the intervention. And we actually don't, in our experimental trials, use no treatment controls. And so we have a bolstered comparison condition where we're actually at least disseminating information about kids' mental health, around approaches that may, be helpful to help kids if they have emerging difficulties, and some of the limited resources that are available. And so, as I said, 3,000 plus kids in Uganda actually journeying through these types of interventions with their family members. And there's a longitudinal follow-up, smaller scale in Ghana and Kenya. And so the notion being that this is not a small study in Uganda, it's really meant to set the stage for how countrywide you could screen kids for challenges, you could embed interventions that can be delivered by naturally existing resources, and that really feel like they're owned by the Ugandan government, and then in the smaller sense by the Kenyan and Ghana health ministries. So at the time that I put these slides together, there were 2,700 dyads, and working through a 16-week intervention. We trained 60 parent peers, 60 community health workers, and so lots of work continues, and some of our families have actually finished the intervention and are now in longitudinal follow-up. The most important kind of sets of information on this slide has to do probably with the pictures as opposed to the words. They're examples of the intensive collaboration that has happened within each of our country contexts. And Teresa asked me to just say a word about how challenging this collaboration is. Multiple meetings, multiple contacts to get people to attend the meetings. If you can't attend the meetings, our in-country colleagues go to you to keep you up to date on what's happening, with the adaptation of the intervention. How is the training going? To really keep people on board and invested. Tremendous amounts of work go into those collaborative efforts, as well as adapting the measures. Many of these measures have not been used widely on the African continent, and so really to do the work both on the research side as well as the program side to make something of real meaning. And so lots of training activities, and now sharing. I think what's really important is that the sharing doesn't happen between US and the countries, but also among our country partners. There's also a set of calls now where the US partners aren't even on those calls, that they're in country, on the continent. Our colleagues are really sharing information around the work that they're doing together. Part of the efforts has been not only to develop new solutions and test those, but also to create information for policymakers. Many of the communities that we are in, there's not even good prevalence data for what are the challenges that kids are experiencing. How do we know whether they're experiencing, mental health challenges? And so now across our country context, the data from our baseline is being used, we hope, in collaboration with our health departments, health ministries, to really think hard about what new supports really need to happen for kids to increase and improve their mental health. So we conduct research, pretty sizable randomized experiments in Uganda, and then smaller scale in Ghana and Kenya. But along that journey of that collaborative process to field studies like ours, we're also truly trying to both invest and also learn from what are the choices, decision points, and kind of procedures that occur within these studies. So I'll just talk a little bit about some capacity building activities. We have an annual conference now. It's amazing that we're going to have the 4th annual conference on child behavioral health in Sub-Saharan Africa this year. It is again in Uganda, where we're trying to pull together many, many interested people, both across the country and across the continent. We do a lot of, when we have the opportunity to be face-to-face, a lot of workshops that are actually not only facilitated by us, but really now is people on the continent in the lead. We invite not only researchers to the conference, but also our policymakers come from each of our country contexts to contribute and participate. So it's very challenging, as Teresa knows, to make these budgets stretch far enough so that we can actually have always young people, families, community leaders, and government officials at the same table in everything that we do. And so that's been kind of both challenging and really, really rewarding. We also try to invest in a set of pipelines of new investigators, whether those be university students or other faculty members at the universities that we collaborate with, to really try to have enough funding so that people can come to the conference, travel. This year we will have secondary high school students as well as university students at our conference to really maximize the pipeline, and we're grateful to National Institute of Mental Health for supporting some of that conference as well. There's also a fellowship program where new investigators come not only from the US. Tyrone Parchment, who's on your faculty now, is one of those investigators he's not able to be on the call, but as he popped in for a few minutes before we started, he said, "I'll see you in Uganda." And so he's one of those initial fellows that we continue to hopefully support along with all of you at Boston College. So I'm going to end by policy engagement. And I'm going to end by just kind of talking through why is it so important to keep up, both in the US, but also in our work on the continent, keep in relationship with government officials. And this is unnatural for investigators. I spent, got referred to my previous employment, some of the body of work. You don't get that body of work without being in this game for decades. And I have to admit that very many of my studies did not have government officials at the beginning, ministers of health, directors of the Office of Mental Health in New York State or in the US. This this particular mechanism that both Teresa and I are funded on required you to come in with policymakers, required you to actually identify ministers of health that were going to help you along this journey. So the investment in how to keep them involved is really both a huge challenge because they turn over often. You're elected, you're not elected, you are hired, you're fired as a minister of health. There's a government change and the ministers change. But how to keep your colleagues really in relationship is very challenging. One of the prime ways that we have had an easier time is because although the ministers change, many times our NGO partners do not. Though their directors have some stability that sometimes elected officials do not. And so those NGO partners who are really well known in country have been really big champions for us. Save the Children, TPO, Uganda, Kenya, Basic Needs. Those are some of our NGO partners that have been stably in country for a long time caring about mental health. And so those are some of the partners that have really helped facilitate these relationships. We also have invested in bringing people from the continent to the US. These trips are incredibly important because you get some dedicated time if you invite your elected officials, members of parliament, to really work hard together, both in country, but also in the US. It was actually a meeting that Dr. Fred, who is standing next to me in this particular picture, as you look at the picture on my right, these are members of parliament, members of our NGO partners that attended a conference that Dr. Fred sponsored here in St. Louis. It was after this meeting that members of parliament asked us to come and speak to them about their mental health bill. There is a mental health bill being worked on right now in Uganda. I know very little, I have to admit, as a scientist about writing legislation, but I learned very quickly in collaboration with our government partners here in the US and people here at Washington University about some of the ways that you can insert language into legislation. So the parliamentarians asked us to look at their bill and make recommendations. So what was really important and starkly missing from this bill, there was no mention of children or adolescents at all. It was all focused on adults, which is pretty typical of mental health even in the US, is that disproportionately the kind of focus still is on adults and adults with serious mental illness as opposed to children and prevention and early intervention. So we had the opportunity through creating quickly, and that's the other thing that scientists and researchers don't do well, quickly creating a series of 3 policy briefs that put together both language that you could cut and paste into the bill that focused in on children, focused in on workforce issues, and focused in on stresses and strains related to poverty, and in language that we hope gets inserted in the final mental health bill to influence what happens in the country in terms of new supports for children. So there's lots of lessons learned. There's lots of lessons learned around kind of how you stretch limited financial resources to invest in the next generation of scientists and academic leaders, but also in government officials. There's lots of lessons learned around mental health as a very challenging focus because it still holds a lot of stigma. There's lots of learning around the demands of scaling, new supports up, as well as lots of learnings about what facilitates that process. So I'm going to take a breath, stop there, because I've talked at you for about 30 minutes, but I want to just acknowledge really the support of amazing sets of partners around the globe. And I'm happy to field questions or for Teresa to push me or Gautam in one direction or another of things that I haven't said, but I'm happy to just engage with you for a little while and see if I can be helpful to your work.
Sure. This is Teresa. Thank you so much, Mary. That was really fabulous, and you're truly a leader in how to conceptualize partnerships at all levels and truly actualize them. So we, really appreciate having this opportunity to learn from you. I wanted to know, when I take in the scale of what you're pulling off here, it's pretty stunning that you have this trial across multiple sites, across over 3,000 dyads of children and parents, and then across 4 country sites. So I was just wondering, what are the mechanisms you have in place to coordinate? Like what are the key meetings? You have the annual meeting you talked about. How do you ensure that you're attending to all the different components of Smart Africa, all the different stakeholder groups, and both the scientific but also the collaborative goals across countries and with governments across countries?
Right. It is staggering. So the first, and this is a coping mechanism learned long ago, Teresa, I never look at the whole thing. So these talks that I just did freak me out too, as well as, I think that what has led to some of the success or our ability to problem solve the challenge has to do with investment in relationships. And so there's actually no getting around that, is what I kind of learned years ago, is that that if, and Gautam will know that this role as a dean is pretty demanding. And so if I wanted to keep up any level of scientific involvement, I had to kind of figure out, how did this work, how is this work going to situate itself in existing relationships, that we had strong relationships with our in-country investigators. These are not new relationships for us. Our country partners in South Africa, I've been working with since 1999. Dr. Fred has been in Uganda for the last 15 years. Our partners in Ghana, spread across social work and public health, some of those faculty are our alums from the Brown School. Our partners in Kenya are probably the newest relationships we have, and we have a very strong colleague at NYU who has a 10-year relationship. So the in-country investigators, those relationships they're not brand new, and they are invaluable because they are the ones on the ground pushing this work forward day to day. The second thing, though, is that coordination and collaboration takes effort. And so probably 4 days a week at 7 a.m., we are on a set of Skype calls with one set of collaborators or others, with them talking about the recent successes, the challenges, keeping National Institute of Mental Health up to date. As a matter of fact, sometimes I think we wear NIMH out because our program officials like to be on those calls, except literally it's Monday through Thursday. So I think that it is that level of collaboration is really needed. And although they're brief calls, we don't stay on for hours and hours. Sometimes we can get off in 30 minutes. Touching base before things get to be really problematic is really some of the key, because there's not a great template to really use for how is it that you approach, for example, Dr. Fred in Uganda is in 30 schools. So what's the mechanism? Should you approach each of the headmasters individually? Well, yes, but should you round them all up together in informational meetings and periodic check-ins? Yes. When things go wrong, what's the team that really needs to go out? It has been that level of intensity that I think is really important. And I think that there's no substitute for communication, for relationships. And then when we're together, and you've been to one of those meetings in Uganda, we use probably every waking moment of face-to-face time to actually continue to build those relationships and try to create plans. I do think that we have pretty detailed operation plans. They're written down. We have a set of students that we work with. We have, you probably have an equivalent at Boston College, but we have a mechanism called a Master's Research Fellow that they're the school funds or the investigators fund. We have 2 Master's Research Fellows, part of their fellowship. They are on the calls with us every morning at 7 a.m. Taking notes, really working to make sure that everybody's on the same page. So I think that our use of students is really important, but I think that there's no substitute for actually the kind of time that you have to put in. In terms of policymakers, they are hard to get on those calls. They do sometimes get on those calls, but mostly they get on the calls because our in-country team brings, electronic equipment to their office, and our, cellular phone that actually allows them to participate on some of the calls. Conference planning is the same way, that we want them to plan the conference. We want our policymakers to be on the plenaries. And so it often requires, members of our team to go to their offices and if they're not available, to reschedule those calls. So I hope I gave you a sense that it's a lot, but it's also, I don't know any shortcuts. And so Teresa, or if you or other people in the room know, I'd be really happy to listen, because we're trying to figure out how do you create a roadmap, but it's pretty intense. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think there are any shortcuts, and then it gets down to resources and adequate staffing. And I think that's a theme when you're trying to run a huge scale-up study that's very complex and real world, as well as do all of that engagement. How big is your team, for instance, in Uganda?
The team is probably, the core team is probably 12 people. And then we hire a lot of students as interviewers when we have assessments, and we hire a lot of community workers, if you will, when we have busy assessment periods. So we have both core staff as well as kind of part-time staff that actually, again, the pipeline is pretty important. That's actually why we typically stay in relationship and across projects with the same set of investigators and colleagues, because they also have pipelines to the next generation of staff. And so many of the people that are on core staff now, they were interviewers at some point in their education. Your dean also knows that we have a pipeline actually to Washington University from some of our country partners. They get their master's degrees. A couple recently graduated from the Brown School and now are back in country running either this Smart Africa study or other studies that kind of scaffold the team. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. So I don't want to hog. I have so many more questions, but I want to make sure that others get a chance. So if there are questions in the room or online, please let us know.
People might be muted too. Yeah. Please go ahead.
Hi, Mary. Thank you so much for sharing this work with us. It's really incredible to see all the moving parts and how much work you put into making it work together. I have two questions. So I'm a first-year doctoral student in Teresa's lab.
Awesome.
And I'm really interested in implementation research and implementation science and how to encourage the uptake of evidence-based mental health supports. Coming in sort of at this stage in my career development, what are some key sort of skills that I can focus on, and how can I cater sort of my education to the needs of what you're seeing where you work?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm so glad you're in the work, and I'd love to be in Teresa's lab. So that must be an awesome place to learn from. So, I think there's a couple of things. I think that, and actually, let me also tell you that we have a fellowship program. It's funded by the National Institute of Mental Health. It's an R25 that I can share with Teresa if your lab wants to either write one of these, or also if you wanted to join us. We picked a cohort of new investigators, doctoral students, and early career investigators that have travel awards for the conference. So you might be one of those people that apply in future years. So I think that there's two things you can do. The first is you can learn as much as possible around how do you do rigorous research. Your ability to have strong method skills, to really know design, to really know measurement, to really, understand advanced data analysis. I think you really need to be well trained. And I think if you're in, BC, if you're in Teresa's lab, you're going to get that rigorous research training. That, though, is really not enough to do this work. And so our particular global fellowship, when we wrote it, we called it Researcher Resilience Training, RRT. And I smile even when I said that NIH actually funded that. But they did, because there's a set of other, what sometimes people call soft skills or interpersonal skills, that is really needed to collaborate. And so research training by itself, without being able to really humbly learn from in-country investigators, to not only talk but listen, to be willing to find space, really find space where your collaborators can change what you're doing, as opposed to you convince them that this is what we're going to do, is really challenging. And it requires kind of really working on yourself and that learning stance that you bring to other country contexts, and the respect that you bring to people that day in and day out lead schools or try to educate kids or try to run a clinic when they don't have the resources to do that. Your interest in learning about them and their worldview, and part of why I love doing both US-based science as well as global science, is because I find that I'm much more open in global context to learn, and to really try to listen to the people in country around what they think is best, and then use my rigorous research training to help them answer the questions that they really care about. And so that I think is really important, to also invest in yourself and your ability to really form relationships and understand that trust and communication, these are ongoing processes. I never get there, really. And because this work is so fraught, and there's underneath it so complicated, but that I'm really in it with others. So I think it's not just what you know, it's also who you are. And I think that this work has helped to shape kind of who I am. And I'll give you one really concrete example. When I first went to South Africa in really the height of the HIV epidemic, although we still have pretty significant issues in Sub-Saharan Africa today, we went as primary preventionists, and so we focused on kids and their families to keep kids negative. And when we put together our community, what we call a community collaborative board, in KwaZulu-Natal, which is, if you drew a 60-kilometer ring around Durban, South Africa, that's where the kind of epicenter of the AIDS epidemic kind of was when we entered South Africa. The board essentially said, you can't talk about puberty, you can't talk about sex, you can't talk about risk-taking, you can't talk about HIV in your intervention. This multiple family group thing sounds okay, bringing kids together, but you can't talk about any of those things. And so it was so challenging to really listen to why, as opposed to start talking and kind of convince people about all the reasons that you needed to dive into this, and people were dying. And essentially what they were saying to me, which was so wise, was if you come in here and violate cultural norms, your program, like so many others, will be rejected. If you actually work with us, we probably have some of the solutions, which they did. These cartoon books that had families advise other families as opposed to talking directly with kids about these hot topics. But that's a kind of a stark example of, had I gone in there and barreled in and said, this is what you have to do to help kids stay negative, we never would have been successful. And so that's an experience that, there's been so many others of those that I had to learn. So that's a long answer to your pretty simple question. So I hope that helped.
That was exactly what I was looking for. So I really appreciate that. And then my second question, I think I'll wait on, maybe pursue them more myself, and then look into your conference later.
Cool. That's great. Thank you. Any other questions?
I have a question. So my name's Alethea DeRogers. I'm a new research assistant professor at Boston College School of Social Work,
Nice.
working with Teresa. And my primary responsibility is going to be to lead a new implementation science R01 that links with the U19 Youth Forward study in Sierra Leone. And this study investigates diffusion and spillover of mental health benefits among peers and caregivers of youth who are receiving the YRI.
Good.
So that's who I am. I am fairly familiar with what's been going on in the U19 study on the ground in Sierra Leone and the capacity building piece. And so I'm not sure if you can answer this question, but I'm curious, it seems like you have strong university partnerships in country, that there are university systems where you're recruiting students and there are investigators that are related to the university. And my understanding in Sierra Leone is this is very challenging. The university is less organized and less of it's harder to partner and sort of draw from that and build upon that. And Teresa, if I'm not getting that right, please jump in and let me.
Well, it's decimated, really. You know, the University of Sierra Leone, and some of our colleagues from the University of Sierra Leone are on the line, was the Athens of West Africa before the war, but decimated by an 11-year civil war and then the Ebola outbreak, where funding has been towards certain topics and less so really strengthening the university system. So we're working with the university that oftentimes does not have power, does not have Wi-Fi, does not have funding, does not have administrative support for the faculty to submit grants. They'd have to do the whole thing themselves and walk it to mail it. So, you know, we're in a very challenging context for thinking about how to link to existing systems and how to calibrate where to start with real meaningful partnerships around capacity building.
Yeah, so my question is, if you have, Mary, any guidance or feedback or input about capacity building in that context.
So I probably I probably didn't do as good a job as Teresa just did about describing the real challenges of being an academic in a lower resource country context that really have been impacted by war, poverty, you know, some investments by the government in an educational system, but not the same resources anywhere, the same resources that we enjoy in the U.S. So why I have such respect for the in-country investigators is because they are actually navigating the challenges that Teresa just described, right? So power is on and off. In the Wi-Fi, the internet is on and off. We have one of our investigators from Kenya who's at a pretty well-respected university system. But she submitted her K award from the Internet Cafe, and her grant administrator had to go with her because he's the signing official to push the final send button. Right? So the level of obstacles that, you know, in country, whether you be a health minister, whether you're a health minister, or whether you're a leader of an NGO, or whether you're a university faculty member, they're significant. And yet, I think what's really important is there is a true commitment to the work, to learning more. There's a real appreciation for the opportunity, and then there's also a real assertion of I am your colleague and you're equal. And as a matter of fact, if there's any power imbalance, it really needs to be on my side, which is I know this country context much better than you do. So I think that it is not small to get on these calls. Many people have to take them from outside their buildings and try to get cell phone minutes that actually will work, or go to a cafe that actually still has the internet on. So those challenges are real, and in some situations, there's, for example, South Africa university system has more resources, but administrative support is almost non-existent. And so those are the kinds of things that if we try to lower the burden as much as we can on our colleagues, but also they're tremendous colleagues. They're really invested in trying to do this work, but everything takes, I don't know, 5 times, 10 times longer than you would expect it. And that's really quick because of the obstacles that our colleagues have to navigate. Yeah.
And Mary, do you have, I know you have Dr. Fred, and he's based at WashU and goes back and forth. So do you have in-country academic partners that help, and how are their lives structured? Are you able to cover some of their time, and how, we have found that even concepts of FTE, covering percent time of someone, aren't very well understood, and there's a massive teaching and mentorship load on our in-country faculty. So having them be present in the research has been really challenging, and we almost have to, do the same approach we do with the policymakers, where we go to them, we sit in their office, we chase them around, but having them come and, be participating in field work or team meetings can be really challenging, given that they're teaching and they're leading programs and they're mentoring students. So what does that look like on your side, and what advice do you have for groups that are trying to do that in a meaningful way?
There's no equivalent that I've found of like meaningful buyout. You're exactly right. So they are, we have found a set of investigators that are truly interested in having a program of research, contributing to work around kids and families, and they often do it on top of their work. So in each country, it's a little different. So in some countries, we do send subcontracts to the universities, and then our colleagues do receive some additional kind of salary. In others, there's some slight relief, but it is a different game. In countries where there are not a lot of academics, where the workloads are real high. So similar to the policymakers, to really spend time, investing in relationships, maximizing motivation, patiently kind of trying to kind of create something that really does work for your partners. It is very different. And I think that's why, people really appreciate the just also the support that they get. They want careers like we want careers, and they, want to learn things, and they want to have colleagues that they, do new things with. Those are the same kind of human motivations that we have, but they have to navigate a set of challenges that I can, only begin to appreciate. And so those circumstances are real. And that's actually why, Teresa, Teresa and I, write a lot of applications, as you probably all know. It's why we've had such commitment to try to help our in-country investigators, submit their own projects, have funding of their own, around their core mission. So there's a lot of volunteer time that I do that really aren't part of the kind of work that's funded by the center or funded by anything except that, I really want to give back to this set of groups. So there's a lot of unidentified costs of time and resources, and my sense is that NIMH appreciates that, but also my hope is that these infrastructures that we've built that we'll be able to recompete for, because boy, has it taken a lot of effort to build the infrastructure. Yeah,
we definitely agree. And one thing that we've started doing within Youth Forward is with our capacity building core, we, even these seminars, we can show them in person if people can't join by Wi-Fi. We have successfully in Liberia and Sierra Leone had hosted facilitated sessions. And you can imagine that takes a lot of work and cost to get the space and the equipment and refreshments. But we've also had, we're building a resource library, and then we have 3 writing groups where there's a lead. Hopefully in the low resource setting, lead is ideal to advance some publications and other products, as well as using Grit to review people's grants. But in the writing groups, I saw that you have a lovely publication that looks like you have several that are led by the in-country investigators. Maybe using your baseline data to look at, it looks like the one publication you have in your slides is a lovely epidemiological study, which looks at rates of mental health problems using your baseline data, which is fantastic kind of examples of products that can come even once you get that stage of data. And we'd love to hear more when we talk about how the challenges of time, no power, inadequate equipment, all of that are facing these in-country investigators. How do you help them get that publication out the door? What does that look like for you all to arrive at those products?
So those publications are all co-written, and really, the idea that I would need another first author publication just is not really what we need here. And so what we need is really to kind of work in those morning calls to kind of conceptualize the paper together, to put some words together, to put some collaborative writing groups so that nobody is writing by themselves, that they're reviewing and what other people write, they're contributing, and that they're leading those groups. Again, everything takes longer, but we also have a set of tools that we bring to the group, which is that we have the analytic capacity that can dive into that data, right? So you don't have to do every aspect of that manuscript. You have to really work on it, lead the group, but we can also try to resource and scaffold each one of those products so that people can build their careers. So I would talk about this endlessly, but I actually have to go and be the dean next. I have to open a meeting in three minutes, and
okay.
So I'm so grateful for this opportunity, and I'm a big fan of your institution, your school, the people in it, and so invite me, and I'll be glad to come to Boston and talk more. Okay.
Okay, we'll take you up on that, Mary. We look forward to a part 2. And thank you so much for your generous time and wonderful ideas and insights you've shared this morning. And we wish you all the best in your next phases of Smart Africa, and appreciate all that we're learning from you in partnership. So thank you.
Thank you. Same here. Take care, Teresa. Take care, all. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.